Hello and welcome to A Different Sides of Learning. My name is Shakira Rouse. I am the creator and founder of Special Compass. And this is a show where we're going to have an inclusive conversation talking about everything when it comes to supporting students with exceptionalities to reach their full potential inside and outside the classroom. And so on this side, we talk about everything that composes of helping supporting students with exceptionalities be successful, whether it's advocating for them, accommodation, support, or just having that discussion and understanding what it is truly means to be an exceptional thinker in this world. So this week, I want to talk about exactly that. What does it mean to be an exceptional thinker? And this kind of conversation kind of sparked out of one of the comments I had received from a blog post that I wrote. And it was a blog post on ADHD. And it was, I even will even admit that it wasn't as in depth of a post that we could have done. Learning disabilities, ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia. There's so much content that could go into this post that it's very hard sometimes to um, figure out the angle and the scope and who to make this for. And so I try to make it from the perspective of, let's say, just someone that has no idea that this term of learning disability or exceptionality is completely new to them. And I try to really just give like the bare basics, but sometimes I guess in that bare basics, the more deeper context and stuff can be lost in the conversation. So I do appreciate the comment and the feedback that the person mentioned. The post I created, I wrote that it didn't dive deep enough into this conversation when it talks about individuals with ADHD, and particularly when it talks about the adult perspective and more specifically the female adult perspective of an ADHD. And so, Danny, I want to get your thoughts on this. What do you think about just this term exceptionalities? And we talk about the diversity of thinkers that exist in a space. Um, it's very like, how do you feel? It's hard to kind of like define um, an exceptionality and for everybody.
Well, I think part of the problem is that, the way we see a diagnosis is very linear. I guess how it gets presented to the world, there's very common tropes and stereotypes, when in reality, two people can have the same thing, but it affects them each differently.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of hard to both educate about something and try and get people to understand while also giving enough nuance to be like, well, it everybody is different. So um, I think we need to use spectrums more often. Like for example, the autism spectrum I think is a great visual representation of kind of how everyone has the same thing. It's autism, but it can affect somebody differently. I mean, some of the old terms are like Asperger's and things like that, which is more quote unquote high functioning, whereas you have some people with autism who have a lot more needs and need a lot more help, and that's okay too. Um, and I think because as a society, we like boxes, we like everything to fit neatly, and when it comes to learning disabilities and exceptionalities, nothing fits neatly. So I think that a lot of times people struggle with that.
I was saying that I definitely agree with you that we're putting people into a box, and um, that's something that we just in general, like we're trying to put people into a box and no one fits into a box. Like I even feel like remember certain things when you're filling applications out, especially for government applications. It's like, are you a student? Yes. And it's like because you're a student, you check off yes, a student. You cannot also be, let's say, a full-time worker. You have to be one or the other. But like how realistic is that in this day and age where everyone that's a student is just that are working part-time jobs? There are some people that go back to school like in their 30s and their 40s, right? So it's to limit people to one box. I think it's unrealistic. And I do think I like the word when you said spectrum, and I think that's a key thing is that um, all these exceptionalities, they look different for everybody, and it's not going to be the same for the same. It's not going to. They're not going to. Not everyone's going to experience the same symptoms or have the same kinds of needs. It's going to look different across the board, and it's going to look different for across a person's lifespan. So I think it's understanding that as people grow, things change, and so are exceptionalities. How it plays out into it's going to play out one way in your life when you're in grade two versus a completely different way when you're in high school, post-secondary, and even in the workforce. So it's nothing to say that just because you have it, you've been diagnosed in this with this exceptionality that it's going to be consistent for the whole entire life. It's going to look consistent for everybody. I think we need to understand that again, like you said, that spectrum. But I want to also allude to this idea of like I think we also need to, okay, so here's a spectrum. And then I think we also need to understand that how our mind is a sphere. So even though we have these different spectrums where we can relate to and identify with, but those spectrums are going to intersect with other spectrums. And essentially that's how I feel like our mind works. So for example, me being a Black female with a learning disability, my mind is going to function in a particular way versus, let's say, maybe another white female with a learning disability. It's not to say that we're going to be exactly on the same like wavelength. I'm not trying to, I guess, no pun intended, but we're not going to have the same kind of experiences, and those things are going to also shape how we see the world and how we interact and different things when it comes to our exceptionality. So I do. I feel like yes, we're on this idea of a spectrum, thanks to because we talk about ASD. But I also want to be like, okay, we need to understand that that spectrum is always moving, and kind of get into this idea of like a sphere and understanding that our brain is a sphere, and that all these different spectrums are going to intersect with different ways and impact each other and how we think and how we present ourselves in this world in different ways as well too.
And it's not just throughout your lifetime, but also even just what is going on in your life, the time of year. Like, I know a ton of people who around Christmas time have more needs because schedules are less in place. Sometimes people get really like not triggered, but like I guess overstimulated would be a better word by all the
Yeah.
like lights and music and sounds and constantly going to family gatherings, and especially with something like ADHD, then your executive function can get worse during those times. So it's we have to understand that people are people. They're three-dimensional beings, and their needs are going to change depending on a whole host of factors, whether it be an outside environment, internal things. If they're depressed, some people get seasonal depression, and that can affect as well. Just a whole bunch of stuff. And we as society need to be more open to those fluid changes. And I think that even how our like things like IEPs and stuff are structured, they're very rigid and they're not as fluid as they need to be.
Yeah, IEPs are definitely rigid. Um, and I feel like in general, okay, just kind of talking specifically about IEPs, and even you had mentioned it before, right? How like you had a teacher that didn't understand that someone could be have a learning disability and also be gifted, like that. Those two exceptionalities cannot coexist in one in within a person, and and I feel like a lot of the times, like what is out in an IEP doesn't even. I think when it comes to IEP, and I guess this is a different topic, is that it's always the same things I'm seeing in the IEPs. It's nothing that's really reflective of a student's growth, and it's not even. And I don't can't say that all of them are benefiting the student the way it should be benefiting the student and helping them to grow. And so I think that kind of brings me up to another point because like we have like things like IEPs in place, right? You have like government supports, accommodations in the post-secondary level, all these different supports that are designed to help students with exceptionalities, but they're rigid in itself, right? Like even just thinking about it at the post-secondary level, like you have to bring accommodations to prove that you have some kind of exceptionality or a disability, period. Like and you have to prove that for if you want to get OSD or as well too, right? So like what kind of other benefit in our society, which I don't want to use that word benefit, but what other kind of support in our society is asking you to prove like that you are a person you say you are. I don't know if that makes any sense. For like I'm thinking like there's no like there's nothing that's saying okay that I need to prove that I am Black. Like there's no form that, you know what I mean? I don't know if that
Mm-hmm.
makes. There's no form to say that I'm Black. There's no form that proved to have that, or no diagnosis or testing that has to prove that, let's say, I'm a female. And so I kind of feel like, because again, how you said people are people, and there's many different things that could happen to people. Like, people are always evolving. And so again, you could have one student that may need some kind of support and accommodation in one semester, but may not qualify for it. So then how do we give them that support? So I just kind of feel like there's a system here to help, again, people with the disabilities and other exceptionalities. But then it's like, if you don't meet our criteria of what we deem as an exceptionality or what we deem as, a disability, then we can't help you. And then, I don't know, I just kind of feel like now we're coming into other bigger social issues.
I mean, it's 100% a problem. I've seen certain things that are saying that because of the pandemic, people are having PTSD like symptoms. And because let's be real, it was traumatic. This whole thing has been traumatic. People have lost family, friends, all these things. It was huge. It was a huge life event. But PTSD like symptoms is not the same thing as being diagnosed with PTSD. So if you had a student who might have been personally affected by things that have happened throughout the pandemic, they're not necessarily getting diagnosed with PTSD, but they're having the same symptoms, and yet they're unable to access accommodations and supports to help them through that time.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good point. That is a very good point. I never really thought about that. I mean, I feel like now I feel like because we're still kind of in this weird pandemic type thing. But yeah, that's a very valid point, especially when it comes to like mental health and, depression, and you said seasonal depression, right? So then I think that also is where we need to have we really to really reshape our perspective on this whole idea of inclusion, and really planning and creating spaces for accessibility, because I feel like the way we've been planning for accessibility right now has been reactive. It's not proactive. Maybe a lot of, I think now, like if we're saying, okay, let's design a building, now people are going to understand that there's going to need to be have certain things are going to need to be present in that building. Certain things are going to need to be present, let's say, within the school system. So I'll give you an example. Like I'm working with one of the school boards in the GTA, and I've been working in some of the schools were fairly new. So when I say fairly new, it was like some of them less than like 10 or 5 years old. And even just being in that school environment, I could definitely see how um, now there has been a little bit more of an inclusive and a thoughtful process of how we design this space. So, like, do you remember, like, well, I'll speak for myself. Um, when you're in school, the teacher had like to wheel the projector on a cart or wheel the
Yeah,
TV on the cart, right? So now
yeah,
these schools have like the projector is just like mounted on the ceiling, and it's all like wireless, right? These are some of the things that some of them probably say, okay, like that's common sense, but not really. Like, because there's still schools that don't have this function. And again, they're still willing to cart the old fashioned way, right? And so it's those little things like that when it has a bigger impact. Do you know what I mean? If you have a projector, I have one friend that was a teacher, and said that, there was not enough charging cords for the iPad. And like, how does that even work? So then it's those little things that add up to a bigger impact, when we're talking about being accessible and inclusive, right? So I think that, yeah, just like how you said, it's like those understanding how we understand like PTSD, and how we understand how people are impacted by, certain traumatic events. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to necessarily be diagnosed with PTSD, but like, let's face it, like you said, the pandemic has impacted people in many different ways. Where is the accommodation, support, and I guess lenient for, those that are impacted and looking for support, especially within the education system?
And also just having the access to even be diagnosed. I know there's a lot of articles lately with like, oh, why is everyone being diagnosed with ADHD? Oh, the rise of TikTok of ADHD diagnoses because of TikTok and stuff like that. And a lot of that comes from people not having access. Someone who's diagnosed with ADHD at 30 years old didn't magically develop ADHD. They have
Mm,
had ADHD their entire life. They just didn't have the resources or the knowledge or anything to back up what they're saying to get the proper steps to get that proper diagnosis. And I think about people like that and it makes me sad because how much did they suffer in school
mm-hmm.
without accommodations, without support? And I think we as a society need to like make a better effort to just support people in the fact that they support people. Like one of my accommodations for school has always been that I get to listen to music during tests and exams because it just helps me to like have something else to focus on that isn't just the test, so that I'm less likely to have a panic attack. How many people would benefit from just being able to listen to music during a test? I shouldn't have to have a disability to be able to listen to music during a test.
Mm,
It's just all those little things that kind of add up to an overall better experience. And another analogy I love to use is like, if you're hosting an event and you want to make that event accessible, so you make the tables spaced enough apart so somebody with a wheelchair can get through. You are also making it easier for a mom or a dad with a young child to also attend your event because now they can get a stroller through.
mm-hmm.
So it's not, when you're making something accessible, you're not just making it easier for those that are labeled with disabilities, you're making it easier for everyday people.
Yes, yes, and that's the biggest thing. So I mentioned this a couple of times in a couple of my presentations when talking about this. How do we create that accessible and inclusive, space, especially when it comes to the workforce? And a lot of the technology that we have today that was designed, or the ideation behind it was designed to help people with disabilities, have actually just changed society in general. Prime example, text messaging and video phone.
Yep.
That alone, those two inventions alone have just changed the world. And so I really want to, so I know people think that these, like, there's someone out there that thinks that, okay, when we talk about these, like a diagnosis, these accommodations, it's just, the buzzwords and the end thing to do, and these things are not real and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not I'm not here for this. I'm not like gonna accept this. It's like, you have to understand that, like you said, people are people. People are always changing. Part of the reason why we have an increase in be able to diagnosis of these different exceptionalities, special when it comes to like neurodiversity, is because of the technology. We didn't have the technology we did, let's say 50, 60 years ago. So now that we have it, now we're able to better understand what's going on in the brain, learn more information, and be able to um, catch up and I don't want to say catch up and misdiagnose those that maybe have been misdiagnosed, gone under the radar for far too long. So it's not to say again like it's all of a sudden that people are being labeled these things, and I don't even think I'm not even I'm now I'm wondering if we shouldn't even use label because I feel like that also is not necessarily the most appropriate. I feel like there's still like that stigma associated with it, but it's just identifying something. Yeah, identification, right? Identifying, exceptionality that exists and understanding that this is what this person needs to be successful. And implementing this is not going to just benefit them. It could also, like you said, benefit other people. And we just need to stop thinking of it like, I don't know, as like one dimensional things. I always think about it too, like people, like we know that no one in this world has the same fingerprints. Like, why do we think that everyone needs to think and learn the same way? Like, if we just like stay like right there, just kind of think about that, like that would make
Economies of scale.
yeah,
It was 100% economies of scale. It's easier to put everything in a linear method and teach all the kids all the same things, regardless of, whatever they have or whatever their needs are, than to be personable and more individual. Um, a great example is the stuff that's going on in Ontario right now. Class sizes are at ridiculous numbers. And the only way they can be at these ridiculous numbers where teachers are having like 30 to 40 kids in a classroom is if everything is taught exactly the same. This is where a lot
mm,
of the conflict is happening with kids with disabilities, is because they're legally protected to have accommodations or have extra anything. But if you stick 35 kids in a class and 10 of them have an IEP of some sort, how does one teacher handle that? How do you both do everything the same but also different for 10 kids? It doesn't
yeah,
work.
yeah,
And then resentment leads to the kids who need the extra time.
yes, exactly. Um, yeah, I just even though I'm in the classroom, sometimes it's mind-boggling when I look down the list. I'm like, wait, how many grade ones are in this class? Like, how is that? Like, how is that allowed, or how is that like legal? Um, but that again, I think like that's like a completely different conversation. Um, so Danny, if there was like something that you would want our listeners to know, what would that be, like that final thought to kind of help them break past this?
I would say it's that it's okay to not understand everything. It's okay to have questions. It's okay to struggle to grasp the concept, especially if somebody in your life comes to you and be like, oh my gosh, I just got diagnosed with ADHD or autism or any exceptionality. I think what's most important is to listen and be as supportive as you can be, because that's truly
Mm,
what everybody wants and needs.
mm, that's a great final word and advice. I like that. I think I'm going to add and just say we need to, again, we need to be open and investigate with kindness. And I think that, again, like it's to expect people to know everything is not realistic. But when you hear, someone says that they have, let's say a learning disability, be open and be willing to investigate with kindness. If you want to do your own research, if want to ask appropriate questions, but investigate with kindness. And I say that in the sense that you're looking to educate yourself and be more understanding for other an understanding of other people's experiences.
Yeah, that's fair.
Thank you. So I want to thank you for tuning in and listening to this episode of A Different Side of Learning. Join us next week. We'll continue the conversation with a new topic on inclusive education and accessibility and how to support exceptional thinkers and learners in our society.
Bye.
Bye.